Good evening and welcome. I'm Father Bob Koopman, the president of St. John's University, and I'm honored to be part of this, the 5th annual Eugene.McCarthy lecture event. I'd like to start by making a few introductions. We have some very distinguished people. You're all distinguished, of course, but some special people here this evening. We have former U.S. Senator and a Johnny, Dave Durenberger, who is with us. We have former Congressman Alec Olson. We have a number of McCarthy family members, the senator's children, Ellen McCarthy Howell and Michael McCarthy, and the senator's grandson, Ben McCarthy, and the senator's sister-in-law, Muriel McCarthy. So, welcome. Also joining us tonight is Al Isley, a St. John's graduate, currently the editor-at-large of The Hill, a nonpartisan, very popular newspaper in Washington, D.C. He was a close personal friend of the senator and an early supporter of the McCarthy Center. Al Isley was McCarthy Center Scholar in Residence in 2008, and tonight at our dinner was recognized by the St. Ben's St. John's Politics and Public Policy Alumni Chapter as the 2011 recipient of the McCarthy Distinguished Public Service Award, along with College of St. Benedict graduate Anne Linchensky, who is a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives. Would Al and Ann please stand? Congratulations. Gene McCarthy was a special person for many, many reasons. For starters, he graduated with top honors from St. John's University at the age of 19, while also excelling in baseball and hockey. Gene taught here, was a member of the monastic community for a short time, and he'd visit the campus and community often during his days in Congress and the Senate, and later as a presidential candidate. I remember seeing him in our dining hall, surrounded by monks of various political persuasions, and they were always having a very lively debate. And we're very grateful to Catherine and Dan Whalen for endowing the Eugene McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement at St. John's. Through the center's programs, internships, and other student opportunities, we carry on Senator McCarthy's commitment to the common good and civil engagement. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Matt Lindstrom, the Edward L. Henry Professor of Political Science and Director of the McCarthy Center, who will introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening. Thank you.
All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming. So great to see so many folks here. I guarantee it'll be a rewarding and enjoyable evening, or your money back. Just a few items of business first. Don't forget to turn your phones to stun. Second, after the address, there'll be some time for audience questions. There'll be microphones on this side and this side, and some students will be kind of wandering up and down the aisles, so just don't be shy. Raise your hand. We'll get the microphones to you. And last, after the lecture and the Q&A, we'll stick around for some cookies, some conversation, coffee out in the outer hallway. I do have the distinct pleasure of introducing the 5th annual McCarthy lecturer. And we have indeed have had some wonderful and spirited contributors to this program. Previous speakers, and I know some of you have attended these, include E.J. Dionne, Julian Bond, U.S. Senators Chuck Hagel, and last year Amy Klobuchar. And all have really provided wonderful contributions and their own variations on tonight's theme, which is conscience and courage in public life. And this annual public lectureship carries McCarthy's deep commitment to the ideals and principles of democratic self-government. It seeks to inspire a new generation of young people to pursue fresh ideas, to challenge the status quo, to effect positive change in their communities, and like McCarthy himself, to lead with honesty, integrity, and courage. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome columnist and political commentator Mark Shields. A native of Massachusetts and a graduate at the University of Notre Dame, Shields served as an enlisted man in the United States Marine Corps before traveling to Washington, D.C., where he began work in 1965 for Wisconsin Senator William Proxmire. In 1968, Shields went to work for Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign, and later, in fact, held leadership positions in 3 other presidential campaigns. Over 11 years, Shields has helped manage campaigns from the courthouse to the White House in some 38 states. In addition to attending 17 national party conventions and working on or covering the last 11 presidential elections, a lot of years, Shields provides weekly political analysis and commentary for the award-winning PBS NewsHour, and I know that's where many of you know him from. He's also an editorial writer for the Washington Post, where he began writing his column in 1979. Mr. Shields has taught American politics and the press at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, Georgetown University's Graduate School of Public Policy. He's also been a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy Institute of Politics. The Wall Street Journal has called Mr. Mark Shields the wittiest political analyst in America. That's pretty high praise coming from the Journal. And also frequently the most tensioned, fair-minded, and thoughtful. Washington Post calls Shields a walking almanac of American politics. So Mark, we're really thrilled to have you here this evening. I want to thank you for joining us, and please, all of you, join me in welcoming Mark Shields as this year's McCarthy Lecturer. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. That was a generous introduction, far better than the one I received recently in Philadelphia, where the Master of Ceremonies said simply, "Now for the latest dope from Washington, Mark Shields." Now, I admit in the spirit of full disclosure that I stole that line from Senator Alan Simpson, the retired Republican Senate whip from Wyoming, a man of enormous humor, occasional vitriol. Once, when asked his church preference, Alan Simpson had the courage to answer red brick, which I, as Henry VIII said to each of his 6 wives, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." I'm delighted and honored to be here. I do come as somewhat of an apologist of Washington, D.C., which is not easy these days, but I want to establish that not all political scandals take place in Washington, D.C. Not that many hours drive from here last week in a state prison, one convict turned to his cellmate and said, "You know, the food was a lot better here when you were governor." And I do come from Washington, D.C., where the definition of eternity, of course, is Vice President Joe Biden being interviewed by Chris Matthews. That's But most of all, I'm honored to be here at beautiful St. John's, of which I've heard so much, and this is my first visit, and to give the Senator Eugene McCarthy lecture. On November 30th, 1967, I was fortunate to be in the caucus room of the old Senate office building when a tall, handsome Democratic senator from this state shocked Washington and the entire political world by announcing that he was challenging the Democratic President of the United States on the issue of the U.S. war in Vietnam. He would tell us that finally this war is no longer morally justifiable. He urged, let us sort out the music from the sounds and again respond to the trumpet and the steady drums. Speaking that day of the deepening moral crisis in America, discontent, frustration, and a disposition to extra-legal, if not illegal, manifestations of protest, I am hopeful, he went on, that a challenge may alleviate the sense of political helplessness and restore to many people a belief in the processes of American government, may counter the growing sense of alienation from politics, currently reflected in the tendency to withdraw in either frustration or cynicism. In classical times, after Cicero had finished speaking, the people said, how well he spoke. But when Demosthenes had finished his speech, the people said, let us march. Eugene McCarthy did not speak with the built-in applause lines of the practiced platform performer. But when he spoke then, literally thousands marched in the fight for peace that he led. He was a man of thought, of wit, of discernment, and of conviction. But ultimately to me, Eugene McCarthy was a man of courage that was to change American history, to this day, to the way we choose our national leaders. I have a personal note. I first heard Eugene McCarthy speak when I was a student at the University of Notre Dame, and wrestling as only an undergraduate can with the tenets and beliefs of a frankly conservative religion and a frankly liberal political philosophy. I heard Eugene McCarthy speak, and one day it all came together. He made it interdependent. If one were a Christian, one had to believe in the common good, one had to work for the common good. And it was a life-changing experience for me. And for that, I'll always be grateful, as I am grateful to be with you this evening. Thank you. I want to talk to you about politics and why I think politics remains important. We've only had two-term presidents in the past 60 years who served 8 years and left office at 65% approval. They couldn't have been more different. One was the father of modern American conservatism, Ronald Reagan, and the other was a moderate New Democrat, or National Democrat, call him what you will, from Arkansas, named Bill Clinton. One came to office at a time of double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, double-digit unemployment. And he promised to double the defense budget, to cut taxes by 1/3, and to balance the budget. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Bill Clinton came to office at a time of then record budget deficits and what had been economic torpor. He raised taxes on the wealthiest Americans, passed it without a single vote from the other party in either the House or the Senate, and he, like Reagan, felt the wrath of the voters in the first midterm. Reagan lost 26 seats, Bill Clinton lost 53 House seats. And they became 2 of the 3 presidents in the post-war era to have their party lose control of the Congress during their term and yet get reelected themselves after that first term. But what happened with Ronald Reagan was that he asked the question 4 years later, American voters, are you better off than you were 4 years before? And voters resoundingly answered yes, and they reelected Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton asked the same question in 1996, and again, voters answered affirmatively, and Bill Clinton became the first Democratic president since Franklin Roosevelt to win a second term. What did these two men have in common? They had in common about them an infectious, innate optimism. I interviewed both of them, and I remember asking Ronald Reagan, where did you ever get the idea that you could be something special? Ronald Reagan grew up all over Illinois. His dad was an engaging and lovely man who had the Irish curse of a drinking problem, could not hold a steady job. His mother was a beloved figure in the community. Ronald Reagan went to Eureka College, not exactly the breeding ground of national leaders then or since. But somewhere along the line, he got the idea that he could do something very special. He went to Iowa, got himself a radio announcer's job, which was the equivalent of being a network anchorman of that era, and from then on to California, to movies, to television, to the governorship, and to the White House. And one gets the question over and over again. Bill Clinton, born to a widowed mother. He never met his father, raised by his illiterate, essentially unlettered grandparents. And where does the idea come that they could become somebody very, very special? I'll never know, but each of them had about him this incredible optimism, this sense that things could be better. And I think if one looks at American politics through our history, there's only two really distinguishing characteristics of American political leadership that have been constant. One is a relentless, almost enduring American optimism. We are, by actual measurement, and always have been, and it may be in doubt today, the most optimistic people on the face of the earth. It is deep in our genes as a people, with the exception of those whose ancestors were brought here against their will in chains, or those whose ancestors were here when Columbus arrived. Every American is either himself or herself an immigrant, or the direct lineal descendants of immigrants. Now, much has been written and rhapsodized about the immigrant experience and the courage required, and it's enormous, to leave friends and family and familiar surroundings, to strike out across the sea of the continent, to a place you've never been, to live among people you've never met, to speak a language in many cases you've never heard. It's an act of enormous courage, but it's also a statement of profound optimism, that somewhere I can breathe free and make things better, if not immediately for myself, then for those who come after me. And coupled with that optimism is this sense of American pragmatism. Americans are very practical people. The difference between an ideologue and a pragmatist is very simple. The ideologue believes what is right works. Most Americans who are pragmatists believe what works is right. Reagan comes, he raised taxes, and 4 years later, he cuts taxes, and 4 years later, things are better, he gets reelected. Clinton comes, he raised taxes, 4 years later, things are better, and he gets reelected. Americans are very practical. We don't grade on the curve in American politics. We don't grade, and believe me, politics is the toughest of all professions. I respect anybody who goes into it. Most of us go to great lengths in life to avoid rejection. You're probably busy Saturday night, aren't you? You wouldn't want to do anything. And when the local paper announces, and you and I are the two finalists to be the general sales manager of the Great Lakes Coat Hanger Company, and you get the job and I don't, the local paper, when it announces your promotion, doesn't add that Shields was passed over because of lingering questions about his expense account or his erratic behavior at the company Christmas party. But for politics, when you run and put your name on the ballot, everybody you ever sat next to in study hall or dated with or babysat for knows whether you won or more likely you lost. And I particularly like political candidates who can lose with grace and humor. In my half century in this business, I've never seen anybody do it better than a fellow named Dick Tuck, who lost a state Senate primary in Los Angeles. Very, very close count. When the returns came in, a radio reporter from KMPC radio in Los Angeles stuck a microphone in front of his face, and he said, "How do you feel, Mr. Tuck?" And he said, "The people have spoken. The bastards." But the American political party that at any time can come to represent both optimism and practicality becomes, in rather short order, the majority party in this country. From 1860 to 1930, with basic brief interruption of Grover Cleveland for 2 split terms and 2 terms of Woodrow Wilson, that was the Republican Party. Comes a great crash in 1929, the Depression that follows, and the Democratic Party becomes the party of optimism and practicality. From 1932 to 1968, not a single Republican was elected to the White House. In that 36-year span, one Republican was, 36-year span, one Republican was elected, Dwight David Eisenhower, who until 12 months before his election had belonged to neither a church nor a political party. Sort of an unwritten law in America, you've got to belong to both in order to get elected president. In the intervening 12 months, Ike became in turn a Republican and a Presbyterian. Something that's always escaped my understanding, because if you're going to be a Republican, why not be an Episcopalian? They're better dressers. Now, one can argue when the Democrats ceased to be the party of optimism, but certainly by the mid to late 1960s, the Democrats had become crepe hangers on the national political scene, and frequently a very, very pessimistic crowd of people. And between 1960 and 1980, we did not have a single 2-term president in this country. We had a series of failed, flawed, and tragically ended presidencies. We had assassination, impeachment. We even had Spiro, could I have the envelope, please, Agnew. We had a whole bunch of wrenching disappointments, but each time a president let us down, our optimism would come to the fore. We would be sure, we'd be certain, we'd be confident the next president was going to be better. After Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, 2 men of exceptional natural abilities, but each in his own way bedeviled by the demons of emotional insecurity. At one point, remember, Richard Nixon wanted to put the White House guards in so these Gilbert and Sullivan costumes with epaulets, tri-cornered hats. They looked like they'd been designed by somebody in the Menninger Clinic waiting room, for goodness sake. The story is told of Lyndon Johnson laying at Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base, right outside of Washington. That's where the president boards the helicopter to return to the White House. Greeted this day by a rather nervous 1-star Air Force general, snapped off a salute to the president, and pointed out which one of the 24 helicopters lined up behind LBJ was to board that day. Rather tentatively, the officer said, "Your helicopter's over here, Mr. President." To which Mr. Johnson responded, "Son, they're all my helicopters." Well, after these two, there's a sense of relief to have a man of obvious balance, Jerry Ford, as president. How do we know Jerry Ford was balanced? He made his own English muffins in the White House kitchen. We Americans don't need an awful lot of empirical data to prove that somebody has balance, humility, and judgment. But Jerry Ford had been a politician, just like Johnson and Nixon before him, had been in the House, had been vice president, then president, party leader. So in 1976, Jimmy Carter came along, and his message had a special resonance. Jimmy Carter said, "Look, I have never been in the House of Representatives." Okay. He said, "I've never even met Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House." Wonderful. He said, "I don't know Howard Baker, leader of the Senate." Terrific. He said, "I've never taken the law school admissions test." That's even better. Nation's highest political office, Carter said, "Put me in because I'm not a politician." Sort of the functional equivalent of going down the Christian Science reading room to hire a neurosurgeon. Carter comes to office intelligent, conscientious, patriotic, caring, dedicated, but he seemed to change his mind a lot. So in 1980, along comes Ronald Reagan. He hadn't changed his mind since 1964. We kept looking for and finding in the new fella what was missing in the president who let us down. That's what Americans do. We're an optimistic people. We immediately go looking for what was missing. So Ronald Reagan becomes our first 2-term president since Dwight Eisenhower. So in 1988, the race to succeed him is entirely different from many of the preceding quarter century. Instead of candidates arguing how different they were from the president who failed, The whole competition on the Republican side was over who was the most deserving heir to the Reagan legacy. The first to speak was Bob Dole. Bob Dole said, look, there wouldn't have been a Reagan Revolution unless I'd done all the heavy lifting up on Capitol Hill. I carried that legislative program to passage. I deserve this nomination. Jack Kemp, who along with Ronald Reagan put a smiling face on conservatism. Before Kemp and Reagan came along, conservatives all looked grumpy and dyspeptic, like their shorts were too tight or something. Kemp said, look, I deserve this nomination. I'm the real father of supply-side economics. Newt Gingrich was supporting Jack Kemp in 1980. That's how long Gingrich has been around. Boy, he's been around a long time. Newt Gingrich, I do admire him, though. He's a great defender of traditional values in this country. He stood steadfastly that marriage should be between a man and a woman, and a woman, and a woman, and a woman. But Gingrich made the case in 1980 that Jack Kemp, who really was a very inclusive and remarkable figure and somebody I liked enormously, had been the founding president of the National Football League Players Association, which he had been as quarterback of the Buffalo Bills, and that Kemp had probably showered with more African Americans than any of the Republican candidates he's shaken hands with. But the third to speak was Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, who said, look, for 8 years I went to every meeting. I never took a note. I never asked a question. It's my turn. This is a singular difference between the two parties. Republicans really do believe it's somebody's turn who's run before. They are very respectful. The Republican Party is a little bit like the Rotary Club. If you were Sergeant at Arms last year, you're going to be corresponding secretary this year, you'll be vice president, then you'll be president after that. Democrats are just the opposite. While Republicans fall in line, Democrats have to fall in love. Somebody walks in the back of the room. What's your name? Dukakis. Is that Greek for Mondale? Come on down, you know. Is it Obama Barack or Barack Obama? We didn't know. Are you out of the state Senate? You are. Okay, you're going to be our nominee for president. I mean, Democrats are just incredible. Republicans, Reagan ran in '68 against Nixon for the nomination. He ran against '76 against Jerry Ford for the nomination. He finally got the nomination in 1980. I mean, Democrats, if you run once and lose, you are a non-person. The Kremlin never made anybody more quickly a non-person than Democrats do after they lose. They don't even get invited to the convention next time. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing. But Democrats just have to have their emotions and their glands going before they can nominate somebody. So in 1988, in this great race with the Republican side, Bob Dole pointed out, and Dole is a wonderful guy to cover because he used to say things that were truly funny and not intended for print, but he would say them. And he pointed out that Ronald Reagan had not had a tough series of acts to follow when he got elected president. We had all these failed, tragically ended presidencies that preceded him. And to drive this point home, Dole described a head table at a black tie dinner in Washington, D.C., seated at the head table, this is true, former President Jimmy Carter, former President Gerald Ford, and former President Richard Nixon. Or as Bob Dole described them, see no evil, hear no evil, and evil. So, the Democratic fight in 1988 was Michael Dukakis won the Democratic nomination because he wasn't Jesse Jackson. And George Bush won the White House because he wasn't Michael Dukakis. George Bush won Ronald Reagan's third term. He did not represent change as Reagan did when he won in '80, or Clinton would when he won in '92, or Obama did when he won in 2008. He represented continuity. He won Ronald Reagan's third term. And then in the Persian Gulf, George Bush did, make no mistake about it, something that hadn't been done in this country for more than half a century. He put together a coalition after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He got countries that hadn't spoken to each other for generations, willing to stand shoulder and shoulder at common peril. He got the United Arab Emirates and the other Gulf states and Japan and Germany to pay for it. And in the Persian Gulf, he got the Democratic Congress to approve it, the United Nations to ratify it. He won the first clear-cut American military victory since 1945. And he went to 91% approval in the polls. We have never had before or since an American president 91% approval in the polls. Franklin Roosevelt, the dominant American political figure of the 20th century, 4 times elected to the White House, never went above 65% approval in the polls. Why? Because FDR stood clearly and emphatically for what he stood for. A full third of the country opposed him. Ronald Reagan, the dominant Republican figure of the last third of the 20th century, twice elected in landslides, never went above 65% approval in the polls. Why? Because Reagan stood clearly and emphatically for what he stood for. A full third, different third from Roosevelt's, obviously opposed him. When you're at 91% approval in the polls, it means that nobody has any idea what you stand for. But those numbers were enough to scare every Democrat in shoe leather out of the 1992 race. One by one, the Democrats looked at those numbers and said, no thank you. Bill Bradley, senator of New Jersey, people have been talking about running for president since he was a junior in high school, said he wasn't going to run in 1992. He wanted to spend more time with his family. Dick Gephardt, who ran in 1988, won the Iowa caucuses, was president of Des Moines for a week, said he wasn't going to run in 1992. He wanted to spend more time with his family. Al Gore had run in 88, said he wanted to spend more time with his family. Mario Cuomo wanted to spend more time with his inner self. Anytime you get a series of ambitious politicians simultaneously announcing that rather seek the office they have lusted after their entire adult life, they want to spend more time with their family, take it as rather conclusive evidence they don't think they can win. There are only 5 Democrats who weren't under indictment or detox who ran in 1992. Tom Harkin, the senator from Iowa, Paul Tsongas, the late senator from Massachusetts, Bob Kerrey, then senator from Nebraska, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, and Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. Because they dared to run. Because they thought George Bush would come back down to earth, and they were all right. And into that race came a man who changed our politics, and make no mistake about it. I'm the first to concede that Ross Perot's tray table is not always in its original upright position. But he did the unprecedented in 1992. On the 18th of February, he was at 0 in every public opinion poll. 0. By the 10th of June, he led both President George Bush and Governor Bill Clinton, the Democratic nominee, in every major test of public opinion. He did it without spending a nickel on radio or TV advertising of any kind. He did it on the strength of his message, and his message was compelling. Perot said, look, we've had 200 years of this country, through 2 world wars, the Louisiana Purchase, the Civil War, and the Great Depression, and we ran up a total indebtedness of $1 trillion. Yet between 1980 and 1992, in just 12 years with no wars and no depression, we quadrupled that national debt. We did it. We gave ourselves a party, and we passed the tab and the responsibility on to our children and grandchildren, and we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. And all of us kind of collectively stared at our shoes because we knew Ross Perot was telling the truth. And he put that deficit reduction that Bill Clinton made the centerpiece of the economic program, he put it on the national agenda, did Ross Perot. Then having made that case so persuasively, so brilliantly, he pulled out with one of the truly cockamamie excuses I have ever heard in my adult lifetime. Ross Perot said the Republicans are going to sabotage his daughter's wedding. Now, I've been around politics for a long time. I've closed a few saloons at last call. I've sat with people from campaigns who told me all the mischievous things they want to do to their opponents, like, let's order 400 pizzas, COD, to our opponent's headquarters. Or let's call forward our opponent's switchboard to a 900 number in New Jersey. But I've never heard anybody, even after a 6-pack of Smirnoffs, say, let's sabotage our opponent's daughter's wedding. This year, if my luck holds, I will have been married 45 years to one of whom from Texas. I asked my wife, how would you sabotage a Texas wedding other than by showing up sober? I don't know what you do. So Bill Clinton gets elected president in 1992. And he comes to office. And the very first thing he does is don't ask, don't tell. Now, I'll be honest with you. That issue was with us from that point forward until this year, 19 years. And Clinton brought it in, and I was then doing the NewsHour with David Gergen. David Gergen had been communications director for President Reagan, a speechwriter for President Ford, a speechwriter for President Nixon, a speech advisor to the first President Bush. In 1993, Gergen surprised the entire political world by becoming an advisor to Bill Clinton. I'm here to tell you it makes very little difference when you vote for president, you end up with David Gergen in the White House. But I didn't understand don't ask, don't tell. I'd been an enlisted man in the Marine Corps. It was beyond my pay grade. I said, David, I don't know how to understand don't ask, don't tell. He was a naval officer. He was a very worldly man. He said, Mark, don't ask, don't tell is very simple. It works this way. It's okay if Uncle Sam wants you, but if you want Uncle Sam, keep it to yourself. The dominant principle of American politics, the practicality of American politics, is when the economy is bad, the economy is the only issue. George Bush could run against Michael Dukakis in 1988 on who cared more about saying the Pledge of Allegiance and was more committed to waving the American flag. Because why? Because the economy was in good shape. Because Ronald Reagan was leaving office at 65% approval, and you can talk about silly issues like that. But when the economy is bad, the economy is the only issue. We have been through 3 elections in a row that can only be described from 2006, where the Democrats took over control of the Congress, to 2008, where the Democrats enlarged that lead and recaptured the White House, to 2010, when the Democrats were ejected resoundingly, almost losing the Senate and losing the House. And the only way to describe these 3 elections is that they are Mae West elections. Now, those of you too young in the room to remember Mae West, she was the original blonde bombshell in Hollywood, a very earthy lady given to profane utterances. And one of her more earthy lines best describes the attitude of American voters in the last 3 elections, which was, when forced to choose between 2 evils, I always like to pick the one I haven't tried before. We've had 3 elections in a row where the ins were thrown out. That's what they were, and that's what they have been, and that's, quite frankly, where we are at this point. It is it's an election syndrome that, as we face the Republican nomination, I have to be honest with you, I am rooting for Chris Christie, because he and I share a weight problem in common. And I always thought if you could put together a ticket of Chris Christie and Haley Barbour, Mrs. Obama would have a nervous breakdown on her healthy eating initiative. But I got a little worried about Chris Christie the other day. I watched him at a governor's session getting out of an SUV. And believe me, the Russians got out of Afghanistan quicker than he got out of that SUV. We who have a weight problem have a simple test for it, and that is, if you're sitting in the bathtub and the water level in the toilet goes down, you probably ought to think about not having that second helping. But the Republicans are in a position right now. You've got Newt. You've got Rick Santorum, who one of his major contributions was the debate on same-sex marriage in the Senate, when Rick Santorum made the point that if this did become legal, that it could lead to man-on-beast sex relations. Now, I don't know that case has ever been made, but I will say this. Bestiality is never consensual. And the Republicans face that dilemma they've always faced, which is they're a conservative party, but what kind of a conservative are they going to choose? Are they going to choose a 5 minutes to midnight conservative that things are really bad, but they're going to get worse? Or are they going to choose a 5 minutes to sunrise conservative, which was Reagan? Reagan was, things were bad, but they're going to get a lot better. And I loved covering Reagan. I disagree with Reagan on probably 11 out of 12 issues. He was a delight to cover. And one of the reasons I loved covering him was he used to say things that were not true. He didn't, now there was no deception in the man's soul. But along the way, it had been a long way, he picked things up. They got on the 5x8 cards, and sometimes they didn't have a strong empirical foundation to them. We on the press bus, who are admittedly an irreverent group, used to call these little jewels factoids. They weren't fact, they weren't fiction, they were factoids. One of Governor Reagan's favorite factoids during the 1980 election was there are 113 taxes on a loaf of bread. There are not 113 taxes on a loaf. Asked about this by a young AP reporter, said, "Governor, could you tell us your source for that?" And the gip with that 10,000-watt grin of his. Reader's Digest, April 1946, you know, right next to Humor in Uniform, I think is where it was. We're in Steubenville, Ohio, in September 1980, is the day Ronald Reagan delivered what remains my all-time favorite factoid. Trees cause more pollution than automobiles. We all headed for the phones because we knew this was as good as it was going to get. I mean, the next time you're on the interstate and your eyes are watering from the diesel in front of you, blame a pine tree in Maine. As luck would have it, our next stop was in Southern California. We arrived, it was the worst air pollution inversion week they'd had in the Los Angeles basin in 14 months. We went out to Claremont College where Mr. Reagan was going to speak. Some wise guy graduate student hung a sign on a tree. It said, "Cut me down before I kill again." And to his credit, to his everlasting credit, nobody laughed harder than Ronald Reagan did. But Ronald Reagan is the kind of conservative that I think Barack Obama was in 2008, the liberal, and that is there are only two kinds of approaches in American politics, I'd say in American public life, for any institution, whether it's a social club or a religious group or a political group, and that is that group is either looking for converts or it's looking for heretics. Right now, the Tea Party is looking for heretics. They want to punish people. They want to, you know, drum them out. Yeah, you can't be, this is a social club. Unless you believe the following 13 things, you can't belong here. Whereas Reagan reached out to disaffected Democrats, just as Obama in 2008 reached out to disaffected Republicans. And that's whether they're looking for converts or looking for heretics. And that's the test I would make of any one of the Republicans. I covered Mitt Romney now since he first ran for the Senate against Ted Kennedy in Massachusetts. I'll be honest with you, it's not easy to be around Mitt Romney. He's never had a cavity. He's never had a pimple. He probably hasn't gained 3 pounds since he graduated from high school. His shirts don't wrinkle. His suits don't wrinkle. Mitt Romney and rumple are mutually exclusive. He's never been rumpled. And so he tries to overcome this by being just kind of one of the guys. And so he had lunch with a bunch of us political reporters, and he comes in and started immediately going to flatter us. And he said, you know, I was saying to my wife, Ann, this morning, I'm going to be meeting with these kingmakers, these influence. He said, Ann, I said to Ann, said Mitt Romney, did you ever think in your wildest dreams I'd be meeting with these real political kingmakers? And she said to me, Mitt, you're not in my wildest dreams. Now, I admit I like that. I really did. So, I've talked too long, and I'm sorry. I really have. But I do want to say that I think the American voters, the best description of us is that we're philosophically conservative, but we're operationally liberal. And that offends people on both sides. And I say that, and they say, what do you mean? I say, well, you ask American voters in the abstract, what about the federal? Pain in the neck. Government's a pain in the neck. Too much red tape. Get them off my back, out of my pocket. Can't stand them. Say, wow, pretty ardently conservative folks, and we are. However, these very same Americans, when told that just outside of Pocatello, Idaho, a single can of tuna fish has been discovered with a trace of botulism in it, have a uniform American reaction. Where the hell was the federal government? I want a report in my office in 24 hours, and I want some heads to roll. We all want this effective, energetic, small federal government working on our side 24 hours a day, cheap. And that really is what is sort of the conundrum of our politics as we head into it. I want to say that I do believe in politics, that politics, in addition to being great fun, politics is basically the peaceable resolution of conflict among legitimate competing interests. In a continental nation as big and brawling and diverse as ours, I don't know how else, except through the politics and the political process and the people who care enough to be involved, we can resolve our differences and live together. Compromise is the best alternative to brute muscle or money or raw numbers. Compromises that are both wise and just are crafted through the dedication, the skill, and yes, the intelligence of our elected and unelected politicians. Elections have been rightly described as a one-day sale. If you're a candidate, your fate is front-page news. By 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you will experience the ecstasy of victory, or you'll endure the agony of defeat. Having worked on 4 losing presidential campaigns earlier in my life, and having covered the last 7 as a journalist, I admire enormously those candidates who do run and do lose. But I believe most of all in politicians who are courageous, like Eugene.McCarthy. The first time I ever slept in the same quarters with African Americans or took orders from African Americans was at Parris Island in Marine Corps boot camp. And it was the political courage of one man, President Harry Truman, who ended the racial segregation of the United States military because he believed that fairness is at the heart of our values as a nation. I admired the courage of Ronald Reagan. In 1978, after voter initiatives discriminating against gays had prevailed in Miami and Eugene, Oregon, and Topeka, Kansas, a conservative-backed ballot measure in California, the Briggs Amendment, to ban homosexuals from teaching in the state's public schools, was favored to win and leading in the polls until Ronald Reagan made the difference by campaigning successfully against it. And that was on the eve of his last chance to run for the presidency, you recall. He had run in 68, 76. This was before his last run. I believe in the politics that wrote the GI Bill, that passed the Marshall Plan to rebuild a war-devastated Europe, that saved the Great Lakes, and that through Social Security have taken want and terror out of old age. The kind of politics that teaches us all we owe to those who came before us and to those who will come after us. And that is that each of us has drunk from wells that we did not dig. Each of us has been warmed by fires we did not build. At their worst, politicians like the rest of us can be petty, they can be venal and self-centered. But I believe politics at its best can help to make ours a world where the powerful are more just and the weak are more secure. Thank you so much.